UCAR, Peter Christensen here, coming to you from the CEO's desk. Going to talk about another fun legal topic, boundary disputes. Now, there is no way for me to cover all the nuances of a boundary dispute in 3 to 4 minutes, which is my goal. Not to cover everything, but this video. Okay, so we're going to talk about a couple, maybe a more common scenario, and that is neighbors, in the 80s, the land was subdivided and neighbors built houses, maybe even the same developer built the houses, so they're all squarely in their parcels. Everything was right. But at some point down the road, a neighbor decides to put in a fence. And let's say the adjoining neighbor, they go and do hey, you want to help pay for this fence? The adjoining neighbor said, no, I like it all open. I really object to you putting a fence in where my dog's going to play if not in your backyard. And so the neighbor said, the one who wants the fence says, well, I'm going to put in a fence whether you pay for it or not. So the adjoining neighbor says, none of it better touch my property or I'll make you rip it down. So one neighbor puts it a good 1.5 feet, 2 feet onto their own property because they don't want to risk trouble with the other neighbor and the ability of the other neighbor to rip it down. So put it up. And in the meantime, yards are landscaped, bushes are planted, sprinkling systems are put in, and it's just now kind of become the border, right? That fence is now the border. Well, what happens if 3, 4, 5 owners, 30, 40 years down the road, the 5th owner of one of those homes, let's say the one that put up the fence, comes and gets it surveyed and realizes, hey, 2 feet is now of my property is over in the neighbor's backyard, and that one's on its 3rd owner as well. What happens there? Well, I mean, you can do lots of things, right? The neighbors can just agree to keep using it the way it's used, and that's a lot of times what happens. I'll bet that's going on a lot in neighborhoods. They can actually formally go and move the boundary with the county. So both parties could just agree, let's just make this formal. I've seen institutions do that sometimes. Churches I've seen do that, where they develop in an existing neighborhood and then set a fence line sometimes further on their property than they need to. And I've seen them give up land on the other side so that there's no confusion over it. But anybody could do that. But what happens if there's a little bit of a dispute? Well, there's a couple things. Again, it's so nuanced. There are a lot of different areas of law that could be affected by this. But one is boundary by estoppel. That's where there's a confusion, where the parties agree that one area is a boundary, some marker is a boundary, and then in reliance on that understanding, property is developed, infrastructure goes in, yards go in, and then they find out, oops, we were wrong. And now the neighboring property says, you got to undo what you've done so I can get my property back. And the courts may say, you know what? It was an honest mistake by both parties. Neither of you knew. You both believed that was the boundary. And in reliance to that, now we're going to stop you from taking that property back. So that's kind of how estoppel. It's got to be predicated by a mistake, is my understanding. And then there's boundary by acquiescence. That's just fun to say. Boundary by acquiescence. And it's kind of different because it's where parties maybe didn't disagree initially, but they, like that fence, they just sort of established a boundary, said, we're going to treat this as the boundary. It's got to be for a long time. I think they say 20 years. And then the court could possibly come in later and say, you know what, it's too late to change that now. Everyone's relied on that. You've sort of just, one of you gave up a little bit of property, but everybody has treated that as the boundary, even though there wasn't a mistake. And so we're going to treat it as the boundary from now on. So that's kind of an idea. Always best to get the agreement in place. You don't want to have to rely on going to court, and some of these others rely on you going to court. But those do exist. Again, if I had a client and I were a real estate agent, I wouldn't take that on. I would refer them to an attorney to say, you may have rights to not have that boundary line changed so late in the game. But again, I'd pass that off onto an attorney who specializes in that. Remember, this is not legal advice, legal information only. If you need specific legal advice, please contact your attorney. Thanks for tuning in.